Greetings, Mr. and Mrs. Middle America and all the ships at sea. This is Ian Punnett in for George Norrie. To the hostile invading alien armies hovering silently behind their cloaking devices just outside of Earth's atmosphere. Remember, eat the Canadians first. And I have to say, last Friday I was supposed to be on, but I had to kind of call a mulligan. The first time I've done that in a very long time, where I was scheduled to and was looking forward to being on coast to coast, but I was abducted. No, I wish I could say I had a really good reason, but I don't. It just, it's one of those doctor things, and it was important that I take the night off. But back and going strong for the rest of this month on Coast to Coast AM, I have not forgotten about George Takei, who was kind enough to at least agree in theory to coming on Coast to Coast for an hour coming up. And so working around that and working around the great topic of the Marvel Comics universe. There are many authors of this new book. It's so good. And so we're just trying to work out that schedule so we could have the co-authors of the book on the MCU coming up on Coast to Coast. And then we're heading like a rocket sled into the end of the year and looking forward to a 2024. Maybe 2023 hasn't felt very lucky to you. Luck is one of those things that we've covered before on Coast to Coast. We have many people who have given different perspectives on it, how to make your own luck. It was a very influential book for me, actually, when he was a Coast to Coast guest not too long ago. The author, well, I say not too long ago, 10 years ago. I don't know. Well, I've sort of lost perspective. Mark Anthony, the psychic lawyer, specializes in communication with spirits. And we are lucky to have him as a regular on Coast to Coast. I am even extra lucky to have him on tonight, as he has been studying how Friday the 13th shaped the U.S. Constitution, as well as history, mystery, superstition, and witchcraft, all built around Friday the 13th. So we'll talk about that. Is Friday the 13th all that unlucky? I mean, do you feel lucky? Well, do you, punk? I mean, I don't know. I do every day. Every day I get up, I feel lucky. But we'll talk about this, exactly what the history is with Mark Anthony coming up, and then we'll do open lines on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett. Well, Mark Anthony, I love having you on Coast to Coast, so thank you for the research you've done for tonight.
Oh, thank you, Ian. It's an honor to be here, and it's great working with you again.
So, and that's what it always feels like, actually. It's like I love how you carry your part of the show and carry that into open lines coming up. There's a lot of ways to look at luck. I often look at luck in terms of the things which are probabilities, but it just kind of comes up, against you from time to time. Like, for example, there was a story on the website at coasttocoastam.com about the cell phones going off as a result of that big emergency transmission they had earlier this week. And the people who are Amish who had secret phones who were busted because those phones started going off, regardless of whether they had the ringtone off or whatever. And it's like, that's a little unlucky. And then I see the story about, I don't know if you saw the video. I would recommend it if you go to coasttocoastam.com, about people who were on this little train in Colorado. Kind of, it sounds like a little tourist train, and they get video of what appears to be Bigfoot walking across the brush, not too far off the railroad tracks. They get a pretty clear image of whatever it is. Now, maybe that's a hoax. Maybe that's all been pre-prepared.Maybe it's whatever. But that's lucky, right, that they happen to have a cell phone camera in their hand as something like that is happening. How do you look at luck?
I think I like to paraphrase Thomas Jefferson: "Is the harder I work, the luckier I get."
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. I don't. I mean, it's like winning the lottery. You've actually got to buy the ticket to win. Because a lot of people, I wish I could win the lottery. Or a lot of times when I'm on call-in shows, people call in and they mistake me being a medium, which is communicating with spirits, for being a fortune teller, and they say, "Well, will I find a new job, and will I find a love in my life?"
Right.
I'll ask, "Well, what are you doing about it?" "Well, nothing." It's like, okay. So you create your own luck in many situations. And then there's times like you're talking about where you could be in a particular place at a particular time and something happens. The question then, Ian, and we've talked about this before the last time I was is synchronicity. Because sometimes you will find yourself in a particular situation at a precise moment which affects the rest of your life. And sometimes that can be really good, and sometimes that can be really negative. My dad, the Navy SEAL, always used to say to me that your life can change in a second. So let's say that you make an improper left turn when you're driving into an intersection and you get into a horrific collision. That 1 second has changed your life in a terrible way. Or perhaps you could be in a job interview and they throw a question at you out of left field and you give the answer that really impresses your potential employer, and then they hire you for a great job. So that 1 second has changed your life in a positive way.
I see that. As long as we're quoting on luck, I think it was Seneca, right, the Roman philosopher. I think it was Seneca who is originally, I believe he's credited with, luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity. And so the people on the train, they didn't panic, they didn't scream, they had an opportunity to take this video of Bigfoot, or what appears to be Bigfoot. They had a camera in their hand and they did it. That's preparation meeting opportunity, and I like all that. I think what's interesting is when luck gets in your head, to your point about the lottery. People talk about luck in that way, and I say luck would be winning the lottery without having bought a ticket. That's just that's a miracle. That's not
that's not luck, that's a miracle.
Right. It's crazy. So even if you have a 1 in 10 billion chance of something, it could happen. So, but I think that kind of gets in some people's heads, right? And they think of themselves, early on in life, they start thinking of themselves as unlucky, as born under a bad sign, that somehow the universe is against their own success. And it's hard to break people free from that perspective once it's become ingrained.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, because once you develop a mindset, whether it's positive or negative, a negative mindset seldom results in positive results. And when in my work, both as a medium and then when I was practicing law full time, and I dealt with both criminal cases and complex civil litigation, and there would be clients I had that were physically injured, or they had severe illnesses, perhaps cancer or something like that. And the ones that seemed to make it the longest, or even defeat the illnesses or the injuries, were determined to do it. They had that positive mindset, I'm going to beat this, I'm going to do that. The ones that gave up seemed to go right away. And certainly, you can only have so much control over something like cancer. But the thing is, a positive mindset has a lot to do with your success in life, because there's a lot of people, like you just said, that go around with this, I was born under an unlucky sign, nothing ever works out for me, and so they flood their head with negativity, and then everything that they're looking at is through this filter, which, in other words, it's hard to be optimistic through misty optics. You're giving yourself not a head start, but you're always at the rear of the pack, because you're putting that intention out there. So luck is, I think it's part of our life, but it's also how we shape things and perceive things. And luck is oftentimes, and that's why we're talking about Friday the 13th, and there's a number of superstitions and phobias out there which, people are so afraid of certain things, but once again, once you begin to understand and approach a fear, approach a superstition, what we find in the study of ancient mysteries and paranormal phenomenon, in fear-based beliefs, there is some factual basis which led to what that fear, what that phobia,
right,
what that superstition is.
And in this case, it does seem like the legend of October the 13th is the truth of why this date looms so large for us.
Well, absolutely, and that's why it's such an honor being on Coast to Coast on Friday, October 13th, because 716 years ago, on Friday, October 13th of 1307, so we're 716 years to the day, is when it is widely believed that the fear, the phobia of Friday the 13th originated. And I love how the psychologists, there's two technical terms, paraskividekatriphobia, which is the Greek term, and frigatriskaidekaphobia, which is the Latin term, both of which mean fear of Friday the 13th. So this is a legitimate fear for a lot of people.
There's just triskaidekaphobia. People, every time 13 comes up, they think it's unlucky.
Yes.
Right? It's just the number itself, not even attaching it to a date or a day of the week.
Well, there's a lot to it, though. According to numerologists, 12 is considered the number of completeness. There's 12 astrological signs, 12 months in a year, 12 hours on a clock. In ancient Greece, there were 12 main gods on Mount Olympus. In Judaism, there were 12 tribes of Israel. In Christianity, there were 12 apostles of Jesus. So 12 was always looked at as a number of completeness, a high standard. But the number 13 was irregular because it considered to upset the balance of 12. And the belief where this came from may have originated in Norse mythology and then mirrored in early Christian beliefs about the Last Supper, that having 13 people seated at a table, one will die within a year. And according to legend, there are 13 witches in a coven. But, this may sound irrational, but then again, think about it, Ian. And for all you coast-to-coast listeners, most cities don't have a 13th Street. Hotels have no 13th floor because many people won't stay on that floor.
But I'm so glad that tradition stopped. There was a time when that's always true, and you can almost mark buildings at a time when people started saying, or architects, or it's just saying pish posh. There is a 13th floor. We might as well call it the 13th floor because you count them up from the ground. There is going to be a 13th floor. It's not like you magically skip a floor.
I know, but then again, of all the NASA manned missions to the moon, it was Apollo 13 that had the disaster. And thanks to the genius of NASA, and I have to put a plug in here for my dad who has passed on. He was one of the team, one of the aerospace team members that helped figure out how to get Apollo 13 back.
So whip smart.
Yeah, well, in that situation, that was about as bad luck as you're going to get.
Right.
You had an oxygen tank blow up on the command module, so clearly there was no way that the mission could be sustained. And, I'm sure we've all heard or seen excerpts, if not seen the movie Apollo 13.
Yeah.
But, they actually transmitted, Houston, we have a problem. And I remember I was really young, and my dad came home from work, and he said, we got to figure something out tonight. He came home to eat dinner, and he goes, to my mom, I got to go back in. He said, we got to figure out something tonight or these guys are going to die. And I said, but Dad, on TV they said it's going to be okay. He goes, that's what they're telling us, but we don't come up with something tonight. And they did.
Yeah.
And so there's a situation that involves really bad luck, but then when you put the best and brightest on, okay, instead of caving into the fear, let's analyze the situation, take all the factors, what do we have to work with, and you come up with a solution. So, 13, yes, maybe that was a coincidence, but I don't believe in coincidences, but it was Apollo 13 that almost didn't make it.
That is, it's funny as you spell it out like that, and I'm inclined to think that this is what there's that certain amount of magical thinking goes into that, and I'm not, but often it's sort of a reflection that people are focused on one thing, and in a way, it kind of helps them deal with the world. If they can avoid 13, then they're actively trying to avoid problems, or they're actively trying to avoid bad luck. Or if they really look at October, if they look at Friday the 13th and they think, well, I'm just going to stay in bed tonight, I'm going to stay close to home, maybe that's its own kind of way of acknowledging that the rest of my life is so good. This is what I'm going to step aside for, and not necessarily be so overwhelmed by 13 that they can't step outside. You see what I'm saying? It becomes almost like a kind of symbolism for all that could go wrong, and so you try to avoid it, just like we should normally.
And there's actually statistics to back up what you just said. According to the late Donald Dossie of the Stress Management Center and Phobia Institute in Asheville, North Carolina, 21 million Americans fear Friday the 13th, to the point where they won't leave the house, they avoid normal routines, they won't drive, they won't fly. They're absolutely paralyzed by this fear. And it's been estimated, Ian, that nearly $900 million in business is lost every Friday the 13th.
Wow.
Studies show that there's fewer accidents, fewer fires, fewer thefts because people don't go out. So there's a flip side to it. We're losing almost $1 billion in revenue on Friday the 13th, which is probably made up on Saturday the 14th. but because people don't, a lot of people won't go out. They're not driving as much. There's less mishaps.
Yeah.
So it's funny. It's there's this, it's bad luck, but then again, it does translate into actual dollars.
One of my children, my oldest son, was born on Friday the 13th, and somebody told me, well, from now on, Friday the 13th is your lucky day, and it turns the whole thing on its head. That Friday the 13th at any time, any 13 is now your lucky number because your child survived on the 13th of a Friday someday. I never really put much faith in it anyway, but I thought, I've always felt very lucky as a result of that.
Well, of course. Your son was born on Friday the 13th. You're a dad. Being a dad is like the coolest, the best thing ever. Any man can be a father, but not any man earns the title of dad. And you're obviously a dad.
I am.
My father was a dad. And it's more important, I think, now than ever for fathers and mothers to be good parents.
Yeah.
I
agree. No, I totally agree. No, that's not a bad tangent, and it comes down to the values that you instill in your children, and if a parent is inclined to make their children fearful, then, as you mentioned earlier, then they'll start to see things through that lens. And it's one thing to be respectful. It's another thing to be fearful. I was rewatching Band of Brothers. I watch it every couple of years on HBO. And that was a big thing. It's like the new replacement troops just were, they were like, the way the older guys thought of it is they were like bullet magnets because they were so afraid and they were so worried and so they just didn't make good decisions, and they would often be the first ones to be shot. So when we think about October the 13th, though, Friday the 13th, are we not accepting the story of, the origin story of which I had always heard was that this was connected directly to the Knights Templar.
We are, and for the benefit of our listeners, if I'd like to just explain a bit about who the Knights Templar were.
Well, then why don't you hang on to that? We'll put a pin in it right there, and that's just where we'll start with Mark Anthony. The psychic lawyer, you can find him online. Just click into him on our webpage, coasttocoastam.com. We'll take you there. Friday the 13th, how it shaped the U.S. Constitution, as well as history, mystery, superstition, witchcraft, all the laws around Friday the 13th, coming up on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett. Mark Anthony is our guest on Coast to Coast AM. And, Mark, I was just reflecting real quickly on something you had said earlier about the 12 disciples. And I don't know whether you know this, but stop me if you do, that Judas was, it was so important to maintain 12 disciples that when after Judas either hanged himself or exploded in the middle of a potter's field, depending on which part of the gospel you read, he was replaced by Matthias, who they had like a job interview and the whole bit, and they decided he was the one who should replace Judas so that they could maintain the 12. And not a lot of people know a lot about Matthias. There's a lot to learn, but the way they chose Matthias was by drawing lots, was by essentially, there's lots of different ways. It could be dice. We could look at lots, which just meant like a game of chance. But they sort of prayed over the game of chance, and whatever it was, whoever was chosen, that's what God wanted. And so that's how Matthias got in, to maintain the 12 through a game of chance. That's
fascinating. Yeah, because 12, like you said, they had to maintain the number of 12, which was looked at as a sacred number. And,
right.
Yeah. Numerology is really fascinating because science is so intertwined with mathematics. And when we look at frequency and vibration from the subatomic level on up, everything is able to be analyzed through this mathematical perspective. So, there's, I believe, much more to this than what people may initially feel.
Yeah, so I accept that. All right, so, but again, in sort of a religious twist on this is the Knights Templar, and you were just beginning to, for people who don't know, to explain how the Knights Templar are connected to Friday the 13th.
Absolutely. The Knights Templar are, you can't study ancient mysteries and paranormal phenomenon without coming into the realm of study about the Knights Templar. And this takes us back 1,000 years in time to the Crusades. And the Crusades were a series of religious wars waged by Europeans in an attempt to reconquer what is now Israel and take possession of the city of Jerusalem, which was being held by Turkish Muslims. And the Knights Templar, they were an order of knights who were also ordained priests. So they were this religious military order, but they were also the intellectual component of the crusading armies. Well, you can't wage war without money. And the Knights Templar set up a banking system from Scotland all the way to Jerusalem, and there were Templar banks. Because if you were heading off to the Middle East 1,000 years ago, it was extremely dangerous, and carrying a lot of gold and treasure with you in the army was cumbersome and also opened you up to attack. So basically, you would deposit your gold, your treasure, your silver in a Templar bank. They would give you a certificate that you could redeem at any Templar bank, like I said, between Scotland, throughout continental Europe, all the way to Jerusalem. And the Templars also charged interest, which was the crime of usury and the sin of usury, but, because there was a financial, practical element to it, the kings and the popes and the soldiers sort of overlooked that.
And it wasn't a huge usury rate, which was interesting. I mean, usury now we associate with, like, the VIG. It wasn't that bad.
Credit card interest. Yeah,
right.
Back then it was about 5%. It was about
right.
5%. But there's more to the Templars than that. The reason that they're called the Templars is because in the First Crusade, which culminated in the capture of the city of Jerusalem in the year 1099, the Temple Mount was seized. And the Temple Mount, which is where supposedly or is where archaeologists have determined the Temple of Solomon was built, was seized by this particular order of knights, and then they were called the Knights Templar because they seized the Temple Mount. And mystery shrouded the Templars. Rumors circulated that they'd found the Holy Grail and the lost Ark of the Covenant, and Harrison Ford notwithstanding, there was a practical side to them because of the banking system. And so the Templars became extremely wealthy, extremely influential throughout the entire crusading period. But then it became kind of a secret society. Not just anybody could join the Knights Templar. You had to be a great warrior, you had to be an intellectual, you had to be an ordained priest, and supposedly they had very secretive rituals. So there was this aura of mystery around them. But what happened was within about 250 years, the Crusades essentially turned out to be a military failure. Even though for a time the Crusaders held what is now Israel and parts of Lebanon and Syria, eventually the Turkish Empire overwhelmed them. And meanwhile, though, the Knights Templar business was booming. And the kings of Europe and then the Pope in Rome, they kept borrowing money. And by the early 1200s, while the Crusades had failed, the Templars were just rolling in cash. And two very powerful figures, King Philippe IV of France, known as Philippe the Fair. Apparently he was like this real handsome young king, but behind the good looks and the dashing smile, he was ruthless and vicious to the core. And his ally, Pope Clement V, they were drowning to debt in the Templars. And, Ian, they couldn't repay the interest-bearing loans. And, and the Templars, they may have been priests, but when it came to cash, they were not very forgiving, and they wanted those loans repaid. Well, the secretive nature of the Templars gave Philippe IV and Pope Clement all the ammunition they needed. So 716 years ago today, on Friday, October 13th of 1307, in a massive coordinated raid throughout France, the Knights Templar, their Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, and 60 of his senior knights were arrested in Paris and other places throughout France. And they were charged with witchcraft, idolatry, apostasy, homosexuality, and, of course, usury, which had been overlooked, charging interest. And they were charged with all of these. And the thing that happened in the aftermath of that is just absolutely horrific. This was medieval France. And even though there was no evidence other than maybe the usury, because they were charging interest, which the popes and the kings have been, giving them a pass on for 200 years. But this was medieval France, and securing a confession was guaranteed. These guys were subjected to the rack, to thumb screws, to the most horrific forms of medieval torture. Everything that you see in a medieval torture chamber was thrown at these guys, and surprise, all of them confessed. And the Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was burned at the stake in Paris out in front of the Cathedral of Notre Dame. And Ian, as the flames engulfed him, he cried out that both the Pope Clement, and King Philippe will meet me before God. within a month, Pope Clement dropped dead from a stroke. About a month after that, King Philippe was killed in a hunting accident. Now, rumors started spreading that Jacques de Molay used his witchcraft powers to avenge the Knights Templars. And if his satanic powers could do this to God's representative on earth, the Pope, and the all-powerful King of France, was anyone safe? Well, let me tell you, when something like this happened, Ian, the rumors flew throughout Europe. And then people started thinking, well, maybe Jacques de Molay was a martyr and King Philippe and Pope Clement were struck down by God for killing innocent men. The evil plan of the king and the Pope was set into motion on Friday the 13th. Or were these evil agents of Satan that we called the Knights Templar, where they finally stopped on Friday the 13th? So now Friday the 13th was considered a cursed day and a warning to all who mocked God.
I'll add as an asterisk on this, and of course we are going with some crypto history in some of this, but also the tunnels underneath the Temple Mount that might have contained treasure has often been associated with the Knights Templar as well. Yeah, so that begins October the 13th. So how does it? Is it because of the Freemasons? Is it because of? I mean, how is it that this ends up, that number, that date, shaping the U.S. Constitution?
Well, it gets even better. That's why the Knights Templar are so much fun. And I want to take a step back. Yes, I'm glad you brought that up. The tunnels under the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, that's where it was rumored not only did they locate treasure that was hidden, the treasures of King Solomon, but also potentially the Holy Grail and the Ark of the Covenant. And when the Templars seized the mound, the Temple Mound, apparently it was off limits to everybody else. So there was always an element of mystery surrounding them, and certainly their vast wealth didn't help the perception among kings and the popes and the common soldiery. But not all the Knights Templar in France were wiped out. Some of them escaped, and they went to Scotland. And in Scotland, because they were intellectuals and they were highly skilled craftsmen, particularly with stone, they became stonemasons. And they became integral to the construction and projects in Scotland and the Scottish economy. And it is believed that they evolved into the Freemasons. In other words, they were the free Templars who were stone masons. They were free from the wrath of the King of France and the Pope. Well, over the centuries, the Freemasons also continued their status, their economic well-being, and they emigrated to the New World. Many of the founding fathers of the United States Constitution, including George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, of the 39 men who signed the U.S. Constitution, get this, Ian, 13 of them were Freemasons.
Right.
Okay, these were very educated men with strong backgrounds in law and history. So in 1791, the first 10 amendments to the United States Constitution were enacted. And as an attorney, I'm known as the psychic lawyer, so, not only do I study history and paranormal and spiritual phenomenon, but also I look at it through a legal lens. If you look at the first 10 amendments, the Fourth Amendment is the ban on unreasonable search and seizure. In other words, if law enforcement is going to burst into your home and search it, they have to have a warrant, a properly executed warrant. The Fifth Amendment is the right against self-incrimination. You always hear about people, I'm taking the Fifth.
Sure.
Right. The Sixth Amendment is the right to counsel. You can't just arrest somebody and put them on trial without giving them the benefit of having legal counsel. But it is the Eighth Amendment, the ban on cruel and unusual punishment. In other words, torture. So it is believed in paranormal circles, and this is one of my theories, that if the Freemasons were the heirs of the Knights Templar, then what happened to them in 1307, on October 13, 1307, when they were arrested, they certainly were aware of this. This was part of their tradition, part of their heritage, and that was the motivating influence that when crafting this amazing, incredible document, the United States Constitution, that there were to be built into it protections against unreasonable search and seizure, the right against self-incrimination, the right to counsel, and a ban on cruel and unusual punishment using torture to extract confessions. And, Ian, I believe that, in a sense, the sacrifices, the torture, and the suffering endured by the Knights Templar was not in vain. And ironically, this would make Friday the 13th our lucky day, because it was the genesis of constitutional freedoms that so many of us take for granted.
That's a nice reversal, and I agree, too. And we should probably also point out, was there an intentional limitation on the number of colonies so that there would be 13 original?
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah. I mean, could they, were they, I don't know enough about that early period to know whether or not there were other colonies that they could have made states, but chose not to because they thought the best foot forward in the eyes of, liberty and equality and prosperity would be to start with the number 13.
It certainly all lines up. 13 Freemasons signed the Constitution for the 13 original colonies, which became states at that time. I mean, there's just so much how 13 permeates our culture. I mean, I'm sure you can take any number and try to do that, but 13 keeps popping up all throughout history.
Yeah.
In some cultures, like the ancient Turkish culture and the ancient Chinese culture, 13's looked at as a number of good luck. But in the Middle Eastern, the Turks notwithstanding, and in the European cultures, particularly in the medieval era up until today, 13 has been looked at as a negative number. But I don't think that we should look at it that way. When the founders of the United States, it was really radical what they were doing. We were the first. The United States was the first Western country, with the possible exception of the Netherlands, that did not have a religious head of state. Yeah. Because you had the Church of England, you had certainly the Roman Catholic Church was heavily invested in all the Catholic countries, the Protestant League in Germany. There were religious, heads of state, and
I mean the religious wars in Europe were raging in the backdrop of that. They went, we don't want any piece of that.
Yeah, we don't want any piece of that. And the separation of church and state, which is enshrined in the First Amendment and the Establishment Clause, that Congress shall make no laws respecting the establishment of a religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. This was really radical stuff. Also, that could have also been colored by what happened with the Knights Templar, because think about it, the King of France, who was in league with the Pope and the Pope of the Catholic Church, used religious charges to crush them.
Yeah, we still do. In a lot of ways, politicians are still trying to, use.
And I'm a big look. I'm a man of faith, and I do not believe that religion is necessarily a negative thing. But when you look at countries that are ruled by a theocracy,
it doesn't go well.
No, it doesn't. And we had some very, very brilliant founding fathers. Now, granted, they were not perfect human beings. George Washington owned slaves. Thomas Jefferson owned slaves. They didn't grant equal rights to women at the time, but they were also children of their era, And for that era, they did a radical departure from the norms. Nobody had ever done anything like this before, and they allowed or enacted the ability for the Constitution to be amended because they also knew that society was not static and would change over time.
Hang on to that. That's just where we'll pick it up with Mark Anthony, the psychic lawyer, to discuss how Friday the 13th has shaped us in history, mystery, witchcraft. More laws about Friday the 13th next on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett.